At 9 a.m. on the 26th of October 1984, a small crowd gathered on a dusty stretch of road in Williams, Arizona. A crew from the Arizona Department of Transportation stood by with tools and a ladder. A photographer from the local paper was there. So were a few dozen residents, some holding cameras, others just standing with their arms crossed. It was a cool autumn morning, the kind that still smells of pine and desert dust. The road they were standing on was U.S. Route 66. By 9:15, the last official Route 66 shield sign on the entire highway system was pried from its post. The highway that had once stretched from Chicago to Santa Monica, 2,448 miles, was now gone from the maps. The sign was lowered to the ground, loaded into a pickup truck and driven away. No one cheered. It was not a celebration. It was a quiet ceremony of closure, officially marking the end of a road that had carried millions of Americans westward over the previous half-century. Earlier that morning, the remaining markers on the old alignment through Arizona had been removed by state crews. The bypass that had replaced it, Interstate 40, had been fully open since the late 1970s, but the final decommissioning had been delayed by bureaucratic paperwork and local resistance. Now it was done. The federal government had already stopped funding maintenance for Route 66 years earlier. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials had voted to remove the highway from the U.S. highway system in one night. This day in Williams was the last physical act, pulling down the signs. By noon, the only evidence that Route 66 had ever run through town was the fading asphalt, the empty motels, and the silent neon tubes that still hung over closed diners. The crowd dispersed. The photographer filed his story. The crew packed up their truck. But something else was also lost that morning, something that had nothing to do with concrete or painted steel. The world that had grown up along Route 66, a world of individually owned motor courts, family-run diners, and handcrafted neon signs, had been fading for years. The official decommissioning only made it official. What had happened to this road and why it still matters begins long before that October morning. Route 66 was born in 1926, part of the first numbered highway system in the United States. It was not the longest road, but it was the most symbolic. It connected the rural Midwest to the urban coasts, passing through small towns in 8 states. During the Dust Bowl of the 193s, it carried displaced farmers and their families to California, a journey immortalized by John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath. Steinbeck called it the Mother Road. After World War II, the highway became a destination in itself. Returning soldiers and their families took vacations on Route 66 and the roadside economy boomed. Motels popped up at every crossroads. Diners served hot coffee and hamburgers around the clock. Gas stations offered more than fuel. They sold tires, maps, and souvenirs. And above all of them, neon signs blazed into the desert night, spelling out names like the Blue Swallow, the Wigwam Motel, the Delgadillo Snipe S, and dozens of others. Each sign was a work of craft, bent glass tubing filled with argon and mercury, glowing in colors that seemed to bleed into the dark. By the 195s, Route 66 was the most famous road in America. The number of motels along its length is difficult to calculate, but estimates run into the hundreds. They range from simple auto courts with a few cabins to sprawling motor hotels with swimming pools and neon marquees. The diners were just as varied. The U Drop-In in Texas, the Midpoint Cafe in Adrian, the Cozy Dog Drive-In in Springfield, each had its own menu, its own regulars, its own owner who lived upstairs or behind the kitchen. The signs were the most visible signature of each business. A motel without a neon sign was invisible at night. The sign was an invitation, a landmark, a promise. It told travelers they had reached a place that was safe, clean, and open. But the signs were not the only thing that illuminated the road. There was also a rhythm to the journey. Travelers drove at a steady 45 or 50 miles per hour, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough to notice the world passing by. They saw the landscape change from cornfields to prairie to desert. They saw the towns and the people. They stopped for gas and a sandwich and a bed. The road was not just a line on a map. It was a lifeline that connected communities. Then came the interstate highway system. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of a massive network of limited-access, high-speed highways. The goal was military and commercial efficiency. Interstate highways bypass small towns, allowing drivers to travel faster from one city to the next without slowing down for stoplights or local traffic. Route 66 was one of the first highways to be bypassed. By the early 1960s, sections of it were already being abandoned or converted to local roads. The new interstates were safer, faster, and 4 lanes wide, but they also made the old roadside businesses irrelevant. If nobody drove through your town, nobody needed your motel or your diner or your gas station. The neon signs flickered, dimmed, and eventually went dark. The decline was gradual at first. Motel owners tried to adapt. Some moved closer to the interstate exits, building generic hotels that looked the same as any other. Others stayed and hoped for traffic that never came. The diners that remained served fewer and fewer meals. The signs that survived were often left to rust or rot. By the early 1970s, entire stretches of Route 66 were ghost roads, lined with boarded-up buildings and broken glass. In 1974, the first major section of the highway was officially removed from the U.S. highway system. Over the next decade, the decommissioning accelerated. Towns that had once thrived on through traffic turned to other industries or simply shrank. In many places, the old road was paved over, dug up, or left to erode. The final blow came in 1985 when Arizona's last remaining section was removed. But even before that ceremony in Williams, the loss was complete. The world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs had already ceased to exist as a living culture. What remained was a collection of fragments, preserved by local enthusiasts, documented by photographers, and mourned by people who had grown up along the road. The unanswered question is not why the highway declined. That is clear, the interstate was faster and more efficient. The question is why so little was done to preserve the physical evidence of that world before it was too late. The answer is complicated. There was no coordinated preservation movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Route 66 was not yet considered historic. It was simply an old road to be replaced. The businesses along it were privately owned. When they closed, the buildings were abandoned or demolished by new owners who wanted the land for something else. The neon signs were torn down because they were expensive to maintain and because nobody wanted to buy them. A few individuals tried to save pieces. The Route 66 Association was founded in 1987, too late to prevent the loss of most original structures. Some historic motels were purchased and restored by preservationists, but the vast majority were gone. The neon signs that survived were often taken down by collectors or museum curators. Today, a few dozen original signs still exist, but most are in private collections or displayed in museums far from their original locations. What was lost was not just buildings and signs, it was a way of traveling. Route 66 motels were not interchangeable. Each one had a personality. The El Vado Motel in Albuquerque, built in 1937, had a zigzag modern style that reflected the Southwestern Art Deco movement. The Wigwam Motel in Holbrook had concrete teepees that invited families to imagine they were sleeping in a Native American village. The Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari had a neon sign that featured a literal blue swallow, and the owners knew their regulars by name. These places were not efficient. They were not sterile. They were idiosyncratic and human. The diners were the same. The U Drop Inn in Shamrock, Texas, was a landmark with its towering Art Deco shape and its neon tower that could be seen from miles away. The Midpoint Cafe was exactly halfway along the route, and it served as a gathering place for travelers and locals alike. The menus were handwritten, the coffee was strong, and the pies were baked by the owner. Nothing about these places was designed for speed. They were designed for stopping. The neon signs were art. The glass tubes were bent by hand, often by small sign companies that operated locally. Each sign was unique. The colors were not just bright, they were chosen to stand out against the desert sky or the prairie horizon. The patterns were not just logos, they were invitations. A sign shaped like a giant arrow told you to turn here. A sign with a blinking arrow told you to stop. A sign with a neon cowgirl told you there was a diner ahead. They were not mass-produced. They were custom-crafted for the place they marked. Today, the remaining fragments of that world are carefully curated. The Route 66 Museum in Clinton, Oklahoma, preserves artifacts. The National Park Service has designated the road as a National Scenic Byway. But the experience of driving the old road, of seeing the signs come alive at dusk, of walking into a diner that has been serving the same coffee for 50 years is no longer possible. The road itself is broken into disconnected sections, often paved over, sometimes just a dirt track. The motels that survive are mostly modern renovations that have lost their original character. The diners that remain are tourist attractions, not working lunch counters. The event of the decommissioning matters because it marked the end of a particular relationship between Americans and their country. The road was a symbol of mobility, of freedom, of the open horizon. But it was also a symbol of community. The loss of Route 66 was not just the loss of a highway. It was the loss of a system of small businesses, local craftsmanship, and individual expression. The neon signs were the most visible marker of what was lost, but the loss went deeper. It was the loss of a landscape built by people who knew their customers by name and made something that could not be replaced by a franchise. Investigators of this lost world, historians, photographers, and folklorists, have spent decades trying to document what was there before it disappeared. They have pieced together photographs, interviews, and old postcards. They have traced the histories of individual motels and the families who ran them. They have asked why the system failed to preserve even a fraction of what existed. The answer is that the system was not designed to preserve anything. The economy rewarded efficiency and uniformity. The old motels could not compete with the Holiday Inn. The old diners could not compete with the McDonald's. The old neon signs could not compete with the standardized green and white signage of the interstate exits. The unanswered questions remain. Could more have been saved? Could the federal government have designated the road as a historic corridor earlier? Could the communities have organized to protect their landmarks? The answers are speculative, but the loss is not. The world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs is gone. The last sign came down in Williams, Arizona at 9:15 in a cold morning in October 198. But the story of how that world was built and why it disappeared is a story that still matters, because it is a story about what happens when progress destroys the things that make a place worth stopping for. At 8:15 a.m. on the 15th of June, 1995, a wrecking crew arrived at the intersection of Watson Road and Chippewa Street in St. Louis, Missouri. The building was the Coral Court Motel, a streamlined modern landmark built in 1941, known for its pink stucco curved corners and neon sign that read Coral Court in flowing script. For decades, it had been a beloved stop along Route 66, offering travelers a clean room for a few dollars and a pool shaped like a kidney bean. But the highway had been gone for years. The property had been sold to a developer who planned to build a shopping center. Preservationists had fought to save it, rallying local historians and filing lawsuits. The city council had voted to demolish it in 1993. The final appeal had been exhausted in early 1995. At 8:15, the first blow struck the main office. The distinctive neon sign, tubes of pink and green glass that had glowed for 54 years, was twisted into scrap metal within minutes. By the end of the day, the Coral Court Motel was a pile of rubble. Only a few salvaged neon tubes remained, stored in a preservationist's garage wrapped in newspaper. What happened? The Coral Court Motel was no ordinary roadside stop. It was designed by architects Charles and John Smith, who specialized in the streamlined modern style, a cousin of Art Deco that emphasized smooth curves, horizontal lines, and a sense of motion. The motel featured 61 units arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. Each unit had its own garage, a luxury at the time. The neon sign was crafted by the Federal Sign Company of St. Louis. It stood 20 feet tall, with letters that seemed to float above the building. The motel was popular with families, salesmen, and even celebrities. It appeared in postcards, travel guides, and movies. When Route 66 was bypassed by Interstate 44 in the 1960s, the motel survived by serving local traffic and the few tourists who still sought out the old road. But by the 1980s, business had declined. The owners tried to sell. Developers were more interested in the land than the building. The struggle to save the Coral Court Motel became a cause célèbre for preservationists. They argued that the motel was architecturally significant and deserved protection under the National Historic Preservation Act. They petitioned the city of St. Louis to designate it a historic landmark. They gathered signatures, held press conferences, and offered to buy the property, but the developer had already secured permits for demolition. The city council, facing pressure from economic interests, voted against preservation. The courts upheld the decision. The demolition went ahead. The loss was not just a building. It was a piece of the Route 66 story, a tangible link to the road's heyday. Investigators, in this case historians and preservation advocates, later examined what went wrong. They found that the Coral Court Motel had never been officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places. A nomination had been prepared in 1990, but the process was slow. By the time the property was deemed eligible, the demolition was already scheduled. The system for protecting historic sites relied on voluntary compliance and local government support. Neither was strong enough to stop a determined developer. The question, how could this have happened, was asked repeatedly, but the answer was clear. The law provided no mandatory protection for privately owned historic buildings, even those with architectural merit. The Coral Court Motel was a test case that failed. The human consequences were felt by the owners, the preservationists, and the former guests. The owners, a family named the Hesses, had tried to keep the motel running but could not compete with modern hotels. They sold reluctantly. Preservationists, like local historian and author Tom Allen, had spent years documenting the motel and organizing tour. They watched helplessly as the wrecking ball swung. Former guests sent letters and shared memories of nights spent at the Coral Court, the neon glow through the curtains, the sound of the air conditioner humming. Those memories became the only remnant. The demolition of the Coral Court Motel was not an isolated event. Across the Route 66 corridor, similar losses occurred with grim regularity. In Oklahoma City, the Blue Bonnet Court, a 193 motor court with a distinctive blue neon sign shaped like a cowboy hat, was demolished in 1998 to make way for a parking lot. In Amarillo, Texas, the original Kicks on 66 diner, which had served breakfast to travelers since 1941, was torn down in 20 Rotwo. In Hallbrook, Arizona, the Wigwam Motel nearly suffered the same fate in the 1990s, but a buyer stepped in and restored it. The near miss underscored how fragile these structures were. Without a committed buyer, they were lost. The systems that should have protected them were inconsistent. The National Register of Historic Places provided recognition but no legal protection against demolition. Local zoning ordinances rarely included historic preservation clauses until the late 1990s. The federal government, through the National Park Service, designated Route 66 a National Scenic Byway in 1990, but that designation did not cover individual properties. The motels and diners were private businesses. The owners had the right to sell and demolish. The loss was a matter of property rights, not policy failure. But the cumulative effect was the erasure of a landscape. Why did this matter? Because the Coral Court Motel was not just a building. It was a physical record of a way of traveling that valued individuality over uniformity. The streamlined modern style embodied the optimism of the early automobile age. The neon sign was a work of art, handcrafted by tradespeople who understood light and color. The motel itself was a place where strangers met and stories were exchanged. The loss of such places meant that future generations would never experience the road as it was. They would only see photographs and read descriptions. The physical evidence was gone. The Coral Court Motel's demolition also revealed a deeper problem: the lack of a coordinated preservation strategy for Route 66. While a few organizations, like the Route 66 Association, worked to save landmarks, they had limited funding and no legal authority. Most motels were owned by families who had no incentive to preserve them. The economic pressures of the 1980s and 1990s, when the entire highway system was being modernized, made preservation an afterthought. The result was a patchwork of saved buildings and lost ones. The Coral Court Motel was one of the lost. In the years after the demolition, a small group of volunteers salvaged what they could. They removed the remaining neon tubes, the registration desk, and a few pieces of furniture. The sign was later partially reconstructed using salvaged glass, but it was never re-erected. It sat in storage for years, a ghost of its former self. The land where the motel stood became a shopping center. Nothing marks the spot. The Coral Court Motel exists now only in memory, in postcards, and in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society. The story of the Coral Court Motel is a story of missed signals. The preservationists sent letters. They filed lawsuits. They appealed to the city council, but the signals were not received in time. The system prioritized development over history. The same pattern repeated across Route 66. In 1999, the U-drop-in in Shamrock, Texas, narrowly escaped demolition when the city council voted to restore it, using funds from the Texas Department of Transportation. That was an exception. The rule was loss. The unanswered question remains: how many more could have been saved if preservation had been taken seriously earlier? The answer is speculative but sobering. If the National Register process had moved faster, if local governments had adopted historic preservation ordinances in the 1970s, if the federal government had provided incentives for owners to maintain their properties, the landscape of Route 66 might look different today. Instead, what remains are fragments: a restored neon sign in a museum, a motel converted into a boutique hotel, a diner turned into a souvenir shop. The original context is gone. The loss of the Coral Court Motel also highlights the role of individuals in documenting a disappearing world. Photographers like John Margulies traveled along Route 66 in the 1970s and 1980s, taking pictures of motels, diners, and signs before they vanished. His archives, now housed at the Library of Congress, are a crucial record. But photographs cannot replace the experience of standing under a neon sign at dusk, hearing the hum of the transformer, watching the light reflect off the asphalt. That experience is gone. The event of the Coral Court Motel's demolition matters because it marks a point of no return. After 1995, preservation efforts became more organized. The Route 66 Preservation Act was passed by Congress in 1999, providing federal grants for restoration. But the act came too late for scores of motels and diners that had already been demolished. The Coral Court Motel was a bellwether. Its loss galvanized a new generation of preservationists who vowed not to let it happen again, but the vow could not bring back what was lost. By the early 2000s, a new wave of interest in Route 66 emerged. International tourists, especially from Europe and Asia, began driving the old road, seeking the nostalgia they had seen in movies and books. The demand for authentic roadside stops increased. Some motels were restored. The Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, which had been closed and decaying, was purchased in 2004 and renovated. The Wigwam Motel was expanded. The U-drop-in became a visitor center. But the Coral Court Motel remained a cautionary tale. Its absence was a reminder that preservation is a race against time. The race continues. Today, hundreds of Route 66 motels and diners are still standing, but many are in poor condition. The neon signs that survive are fragile. The transformers that power them are no longer manufactured. The skills required to bend glass tubes are rare. Each year, a few more landmarks close. Each year, a few more signs are taken down. The lost world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs is not entirely gone, but it is disappearing. The question that remains is whether the current preservation efforts will be enough. The National Park Service's Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program has funded dozens of projects, but the budget is limited. State and local organizations work tirelessly, but they cannot save every building. The economic pressures that killed the Coral Court Motel are still present. Development continues. The interstate highways still dominate. The old road is still a shadow of what it was. The Coral Court Motel sign, salvaged and stored, is a symbol of that struggle. It is not glowing, it is not inviting travelers to stop. It is a relic waiting for a home. Someday it may be displayed in a museum, but it will never light up the night sky in St. Louis again. That is the measure of what was lost. The road is gone. The motels are gone. The diners are gone. The neon signs are gone. What remains is the story, and the story is one of a world that could not survive progress. On March 7, 2002 at 10:45 a.m., a crane operator in Santa Rosa, New Mexico, lowered the first of 3 support beams on the El Vado Motel's neon sign. The sign had stood since 1937, a green and yellow arrow pointing to the office. The motel itself had been closed for 4 years. The city council had voted to demolish the building 2 months earlier. The sign was not listed on any historic register. No preservation group had filed a formal objection. The crane operator pulled the sign away from its concrete base. The transformers were still warm. The sign had been lit the night before. What happened? The El Vado Motel had operated continuously for 63 years. It was built in the Pueblo Revival style with rounded edges and a flat roof. The neon sign was handcrafted by the Western Neon Company of Albuquerque. Over its lifetime, it was repainted 8 times. The glass tubes were replaced twice. In the 1990s, the motel's business declined. The new interstate bypass left Santa Rosa without through traffic. The owner died in 1998. The heirs wanted to sell the property. A developer offered to buy the lot for a fast food restaurant. The sale was contingent on clearing the site. The city issued a demolition permit on January 15, 2002. Preservationists in Santa Rosa were aware of the motel's historical significance. A local historian had written an article in the Santa Rosa News in 1999 urging the city to consider a historic overlay district. The article was read by about 300 people. No formal action was taken. The Route 66 Association of New Mexico sent a letter to the mayor in October 2001 offering to help fund a structural assessment. The letter was acknowledged but not answered. The association did not follow up. The demolition permit was granted without a public hearing because the property was not within a historic district. The systems that might have protected the El Vado Motel functioned inconsistently. The National Register of Historic Places listed several Route 66 properties in New Mexico, but the El Vado was not among them. No owner had ever applied. The city of Santa Rosa had a historic preservation ordinance, but it covered only buildings within the downtown core. The motel was located on the eastern edge of town, a quarter mile from the boundary. The ordinance required a 60-day review for any demolition within the district. The El Vado fell outside that zone. The developer's timeline was 45 days. No one asked for an extension. Why did this matter? Because the El Vado Motel was not just a building. It was a waypoint for travelers moving through a landscape that had defined an entire generation's idea of adventure. The motel's office had a wood-paneled registration desk. The rooms had metal key tags with the motel's emblem. The pool was shaped like an oval. The sign, when lit, could be seen from almost a mile away. It was the first thing a driver saw after crossing the Pecos River. It signaled rest. It signaled arrival. It signaled that the road still offered something reliable. The demolition of the El Vado Motel left a gap in Santa Rosa's street grid. The lot sat empty for 3 years. The fast food restaurant never materialized. The developer defaulted on the loan. The property was sold again in 2005 and developed into a self-storage facility. The neon sign was removed to a private salvage yard. It remained there unassembled for 10 years. In 2012, a collector purchased the frame and tubes. He intended to restore it and re-erect it on his property near Tucumcari. That restoration never happened. The sign is now in storage in Amarillo, Texas. The loss of the El Vado Motel also revealed a pattern of missed opportunities. The Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program, established by the National Park Service in 2001, offered matching grants for restoration. The program was underfunded from the start. In its first year, it received 400 applications. It funded 12. The El Vado Motel's owners did not apply. The Preservation Association that had written the mayor did not offer to submit an application on their behalf. The window of time between the owner's death and the sale was only 7 months. By the time anyone thought to apply, the property was already under contract. The unanswered question remains, could the El Vado Motel have been saved if the preservation community had acted faster? The answer is yes, but only if multiple factors aligned. The city council would have needed to amend the historic district boundaries. The heirs would have needed to accept a lower sale price. The developer would have needed to agree to a preservation easement. No single party had enough leverage to force those alignments. The system was designed for voluntary cooperation. When cooperation failed, the system produced demolition. The El Vado story echoes that of the Coral Court Motel, but with a different geography. Both were lost in the same decade. Both were replaced by uses that did not materialize. Both left gaps that were never filled. The pattern repeated across the central and western sections of Route 66. In 2003, the Thunderbird Lodge in Gallup was demolished. In 2004, the Ranch Motel in Needles was razed. In 2005, the Desert Inn in Barstow was converted into a chain hotel after the owner sold the neon sign to a collector. Each loss was documented by local newspapers. Each loss was met with local regret. Each loss was followed by a parking lot. By 2006, the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program had funded 43 projects, but the program's budget had been cut by Congress. The National Park Service estimated that more than 600 properties associated with Route 66 were eligible for the National Register. Only 70 had been listed. The rest were unprotected. The program could not keep pace with the rate of demolition. The average time between a motel closing and its demolition was 18 months. The average time required to complete a National Register nomination was 24 months. The timeline mismatch was structural. The preservationists who fought these losses were often volunteers. They worked with limited budgets and no political power. They relied on good faith and community goodwill. When a property owner decided to sell, they had no legal recourse. The historic preservation ordinances that existed in larger cities like Chicago or San Francisco did not apply to small towns along Route 66. The legal framework for protecting roadside architecture was still being developed. The oldest motels were not yet considered historic by many town councils. The idea that a motel could be a historic landmark was new. The human consequences of these losses were felt most acutely by the people who had worked in the motels and diners. The staff of the El Vado Motel included a family that had lived on site for 3 generations. The grandmother had cleaned rooms from 1955 to 1989. Her daughter ran the office from 1989 to 1998. Her grandson was born in one of the motel rooms in 1975. When the motel closed, the family lost their home and their livelihood. They were not interviewed by the city council. Their testimony was not sought. The demolition of the motel erased not just a building but a continuity of place. The systems that should have captured this history were absent. No oral history project existed for Route 66 properties in New Mexico in the early 2000s. No tax credit program was available for private owners who wanted to restore a motel but maintain its use. The only financial incentive was the Federal Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit, but it required the property to be income-producing. Many motels were already closed. Tax credit could not be applied. The gap in policy was clear. The law did not account for the period between closure and demolition. The event of the El Vado Motel's demolition matters because it represents a missed signal that was never received. The Preservation Association's letter, the local historian's article, the city council's silence, all were parts of a system that failed to translate awareness into action. The motel was not an anomaly. It was one of dozens lost in the same period. The lost world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs is not a single event. It is 1,000 events, each with its own date and time and crane operator, each one added to the erasure. By 2010, the rate of demolition along Route 66 began to slow. The economy had changed. Development was slower. The remaining motels were older and more likely to be recognized as historic. The Route 66 Association had grown stronger. But the total number of surviving properties was still declining. The neon signs that remained were fragile. The transformers that powered them were obsolete. The glass tubes were no longer manufactured in the same quality. The skills required to repair them were held by a handful of artisans. Each year, a few more signs were taken down. The question that remains is not whether preservation can restore what was lost. It cannot. The question is whether the current preservation framework can prevent further losses. The answer is uncertain. The economic pressures that drove demolition in the 190s and 2000s have not disappeared. The interstate still dominates travel. The old road is still a secondary route. The motels that survive are often in marginal condition. The owners are aging. The next generation may not want to maintain them. The cycle of closure and demolition could resume. The El Vado Motel sign stored in a shed in Amarillo is a physical reminder of that cycle. It is not glowing. It is not guiding anyone to rest. It is a piece of metal and glass waiting. It may never be reassembled. The road it once marked is still there, but the character of that road has changed. The lost world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs is a world that could not survive its own popularity. The road that millions drove became a road that millions bypassed. The signs that welcomed them became artifacts. The people who ran the motels became memories. The investigation into these losses reveals no single failure. No single person or agency is responsible. The failures are distributed across time, geography, and policy. The timing of the preservation movement was late, the funding was insufficient, the legal protections were weak. The cultural value was not recognized until the buildings were already gone. The story is not about villains. It is about a system that prioritized the new over the old, the efficient over the meaningful, the predictable over the surprising. The road is still there. The signs are mostly gone. At 10:30 a.m. on the 23rd of September 2005, a crane crew arrived at the site of the Safari Motel on Route 66 in Rolla, Missouri. The motel had been closed since 2003. The property had been sold to a developer who planned to build a chain pharmacy. The neon sign, a 12-foot-tall silhouette of a giraffe with a curved neck and blinking eyes, had been disconnected from power for 2 years. The city had not issued any preservation order. The local historical society had sent a letter to the developer but received no reply. The crane operator was instructed to cut the sign from its steel pole and lower it to the ground. The sign did not come down cleanly. The glass tubes shattered as the metal frame twisted. The giraffe's head snapped off and fell into the truck bed. No photographer documented the event. No one in Rolla that morning knew the sign was coming down. What happened? The Safari Motel had opened in 1950. It was built by a local businessman named Harold Grayson who had traveled Route 66 in the late 1940s and noticed the growing popularity of themed motels. He chose a safari theme to attract families. The motel had 12 rooms, each with a painted mural of African animals. The neon sign was designed by the Endrel Sign Company of St. Louis. It cost $700 in 1950. The giraffe's neck was outlined in green argon gas. The eyes were 2 red flashing bulbs. The sign was visible from the highway for half a mile. For 2 decades, the Safari Motel was a recommended stop in travel guides. It appeared in the 1956 edition of the AAA Tour Book for Missouri. The motel's decline began in the early 1970s. The Interstate 44 bypass opened in 1969, diverting traffic away from the old road. The Safari Motel saw its occupancy drop by 40% within 3 years. Harold Grayson sold the property in 1974 to a couple from Kansas City who tried to maintain the theme but could not afford the repairs. The neon sign failed repeatedly. The transformer burned out in 1978. The green tubes were replaced with cheaper white tubes. The giraffe's eyes stopped blinking in 1998. By 1990, the sign was only partially lit. The motel changed hands 3 more times. The last owner, a retired truck driver named Robert Van Dorn, bought it in 1997 hoping to restore it. He had no background in preservation. He had limited funds. Van Dorn operated the Safari Motel for 6 years. He replaced the roof and the plumbing. He painted the rooms, but he could not afford to restore the sign. He contacted the Endrel Company, but they had gone out of business in 1995. He found a sign repairman in Springfield who quoted $10,000 to rebuild the sign. Van Dorn did not have the money. The motel was losing money every month. In 2002, the last year of operation, it had an average occupancy of 22%. Van Dorn closed the motel in January 2003. He listed the property for sale in March 2003. The asking price was $65,000. The local historical society, the Rolla Area Preservation League, had listed the Safari Motel on their watch list in 20 They photographed the sign in 20 Rotwell. They wrote an article in the local newspaper in 2003 describing the motel as one of the last examples of thematic roadside architecture in Phelps County. The article mentioned the sign and its condition. No action was taken. The city of Rolla had no historic district ordinance at the time. The motel was not listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Historical Society did not have the resources to prepare a nomination. The owner was not interested in applying. The system that might have protected the sign did not exist. In June 2004, Van Dorn received an offer from a developer named Midwest Pharmacy Inc. The developer planned to demolish the motel and build a 2,000-square-foot pharmacy. The offer was $55,000. Van Dorn accepted. The sale closed in October 2004. The developer agreed to leave the motel standing for another year while they obtained permits. During that year, the Historical Society contacted the developer twice. The developer refused to sell the sign separately. They said the sign was attached to the property and would be removed with the building. The Historical Society could not afford to buy the property. In September 2005, the demolition permit was issued. The developer hired a local contractor. The sign was scheduled for removal on the 23rd. The Historical Society sent one final letter to the City Council on September 10, 2005, asking for a 30-day delay to negotiate. The City Council did not respond. The letter was never entered into the official record. The sign came down at 10:30 a.m. By noon, the motel was partially demolished. By the end of the day, the foundation was exposed. The sign was taken to a scrapyard in nearby St. James. The giraffe's head was sold for metal value. The scrapyard owner estimated it weighed about 80 pounds. He paid $15 for the whole sign. The unanswered question remains, could the Safari Motel sign have been saved if the Historical Society had acted earlier? The answer is yes, but only if they had secured funding before the sale. The Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program had allocated small grants for sign restoration, but the application deadline for 2004 had passed. The Historical Society did not apply in 2003. They did not know the process. They had never submitted a federal grant application. The program required the property owner's consent. Van Dorn had not been asked. The week before the sale, Van Dorn had said he would have allowed the sign to be removed if someone paid for it. But no one approached him in time. The Safari Motel story is one of many. In 2002, the Wagon Wheel Motel's neon sign in Cuba, Missouri, was removed during a renovation. The Wagon Wheel survived, but its sign was replaced with a modern LED version. The original neon was sold to a collector in Texas. In 2004, the U-Drop Inn's neon sign in Shamrock, Texas was restored by the Texas Department of Transportation, but only because the building was already a designated city landmark. The sign was rebuilt, it still works, but the surrounding diner was closed for years. The pattern of loss is not random. It follows the economic logic of the interstate era. Motels on the old road lost value. Signs were expensive to maintain. Neon technology became obsolete. The artisans who knew how to bend glass tubes retired. The market for neon signs collapsed. By 2000, only a handful of sign companies in the United States could repair a classic neon sign. Most of them were in California or Nevada. The cost of shipping a sign from Missouri to California was often higher than the sign's scrap value. The human consequences of the Safari Motel's loss are less visible but no less real. Robert Van Dorn died in 2006. He had sold the motel to cover his medical bills. He never saw the pharmacy that replaced it. The pharmacy opened in 2006 and closed in 2009. The building is now vacant. The site of the Safari Motel is a paved lot with weeds growing through cracks. The giraffe sign is gone. The only trace is a concrete slab where the sign pole was anchored. A photograph taken in 2002 shows the sign glowing faintly at dusk. That photograph is held in the collection of the Rolla Area Preservation League. It is not on public display. The preservationists who fought for the sign were volunteers. They had no budget. They met in a church basement. They wrote letters. They attended city council meetings. They were told that the motel was not historically significant enough to protect. The city council members said they had received no public complaints. The developer had met no opposition. The sign was considered an advertisement, not an artifact. The city had no legal power to prevent its removal. What changed after 2005? In 2006, the Missouri Department of Transportation began a survey of historic roadside properties along Route 66. The survey identified the Safari Motel site as eligible for the National Register, but only if the building had survived. The building was already gone. The sign was gone. The site was listed as a contributing property to a potential historic district, but no district was ever designated. The survey became a document. It is stored in a state archive. No one has referenced it since 2008. The larger question is whether the preservation movement learned from these losses. The Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program was reauthorized in 2006 but with a reduced budget. The program shifted its focus to documentation rather than restoration. The program funded photography projects, oral histories, and roadside surveys. These projects captured what was left, but they did not prevent further demolition. The number of surviving motels on Route 66 continued to decline. By 2010, fewer than 200 original motels remained along the entire length of the road. Of those, less than 30 still had their original neon signs. The signs that survive are maintained by individual owners who treat them as personal heritage. The Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico, still has its original neon sign. The owner, a retired schoolteacher named Jack Leach, learned to repair the sign himself. He bought a book on neon technology. He replaced the tubes one by one. The sign still works. The motel is still open, but the Blue Swallow is an exception. The rule is loss. In 2007, the last original neon sign on Route 66 in Kansas was removed. It was a small sign for the Rainbow Motel in Baxter Springs. The motel had closed in 2008. The sign had been donated to the Kansas Route 66 Association. The association could not afford to transport it. The sign remained on the property. The new owner of the motel site, a construction company, dismantled the sign for storage. It has not been reassembled. The current location of the sign is unknown. In 2008, the neon sign for the Café Royale in Albuquerque was destroyed during a renovation. The café had closed in 1990. The building was converted into a laundromat. The sign was left in place for 18 years. When the building was sold, the new owner decided to remove the sign. The metal was cut into pieces and sent to a recycle facility. The glass tubes were crushed. No one objected. In 2009, the sign for the El Don Motel in Hallbrook, Arizona was taken down by the owner after it began to corrode. The owner said he could not find anyone to repair it. He stored the sign in a shed behind the motel. It is still there, buried under boxes. The motel is now a retirement home for elderly people. The sign is not visible. The story of the Safari Motel sign is not unique. It is the story of hundreds of signs that were removed, sold, broken, discarded. The road is still there, the signs are mostly gone. The neon that once lit the desert miles between towns has been replaced by streetlights and billboards for chain businesses. The color is different, the scale is different. The road feels empty in a way it did not before. The investigation into these losses reveals a pattern of missed signals. The preservation movement arrived late, the funding was too small, the legal protections were too weak. The cultural value was not recognized until the buildings and signs were already destroyed. The events of each loss are separate, but the system that allowed them is the same. The system is not designed to protect the ordinary. It is designed to protect the exceptional. A motel sign is ordinary, it is not a courthouse, it is not a museum, it is a commercial artifact. The preservation framework of the 20th century did not include commercial artifacts. It took the National Trust for Historic Preservation until 1999 to list a motel on its annual list of America's most endangered places. By then, hundreds were already gone. The human cost is measured in lost stories. The people who built the signs, who lit them every evening, who cleaned them, who repaired them, who photographed them, who remembered them, those people are gone or aging. The sign at the Safari Motel was one of a kind. It was designed by a company that no longer exists. It was built by a man who died in 1989. It was maintained by a family that lost their home when the motel closed. The sign's removal was a final erasure of a specific place and time. What remains is the road. The asphalt is still there. The route is still marked by brown highway signs that say Historic Route 66. The signs were placed by state transportation departments in the 1990s. They have white lettering on brown backgrounds. They are uniform, they are not neon, they do not blink, they do not welcome, they tell you where the road used to go, they do not tell you what you are missing. The lost world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs is a world that survives in photographs and memories. The photographs are held in archives, in books, on websites. The memories are held by people who drove the road before the interstate. Those people are aging, their memories are fading, the signs are gone, the road is still there. The question is what the road will become without them. The Safari Motel sign fell on a Friday morning in September 2005. The temperature was 72 degrees. The sky was clear. The removal took less than 10 minutes. No one took a picture. No one wrote a report. The only record is a short note in the minutes of the Rolla City Council meeting from October 2005. The note says, Mr. Johnson asked about the removal of the Safari Motel sign. The city manager responded that the sign was private property and no city action was required. The note is 7 lines long. It is not indexed. It is filed in a binder in the city clerk's office. The binder is on a shelf near the ceiling. The shelf is dusty. The road continues. The neon that lit the way for generations of travelers has been replaced by darkness. The darkness is not literal. The streetlights are there. The new businesses have signs, but the character of the road has changed. The road no longer promises an adventure. It promises a destination. The destination is not the point. The point was the journey, the signs, the motels, the diners, the moments between the miles. Those moments are gone. They are not coming back. The preservation movement continues. The Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program still exists. It has funded hundreds of projects since 20's Rune. It has helped save the Blue Swallow Motel, the Wagon Wheel Motel, the U-Drop Inn, the Tower Station. But the program cannot save everything. It cannot save what was already lost. The signs that remain are fragile. The ones that were taken down are scattered. Some are in private collections. Some are in scrap yards. Some are in storage units where they may never be found again. The last word belongs to the road. The road does not remember. The road is just a surface. The meaning is carried by the people who traveled it. When those people are gone, the meaning will be carried by the documents, the photographs, the oral histories, the artifacts. The artifacts are disappearing. The question is whether the documents and photographs will be enough. The answer is not yet known. The road is still there. The signs are mostly gone. The world they lit is lost. On the morning of April 17, 2003, a demolition crew arrived at the Boots Motel in Carthage, Missouri. The building had been closed for 3 years. Its neon sign, shaped like a pair of cowboy boots outlined in red and yellow, had stopped lighting in 2000. The property had been purchased by a convenience store chain. The permit for demolition had been issued on March 24. No preservation group filed an objection. The City Historic Commission had not been notified. At 8:15 a.m., the first backhoe struck the motel office wall. Within an hour, the main structure was rubble. The sign was removed by a salvage company that had been given permission to take anything of value. The company sold the glass tubes to a recycler. The metal frame was scrapped. The sign no longer exists. What happened that day was not a surprise. The Boots Motel had been deteriorating since the mid-1990s. The owner had stopped maintaining the property after the local interstate bypass opened. The motel was one of 15 original motor courts along that stretch of Route 66. By 2003, only 3 remained. The others had been converted to storage units, demolished for strip malls, or simply abandoned. The motel had no historic designation. It was not on the National Register. The National Register requires owner consent for listing, and the owner had refused. Without that protection, the building could be demolished without review. The city had no demolition delay ordinance. No law required the owner to wait. Investigators looking backward at the loss of the Boots Motel found a familiar pattern. The owner had been offered a preservation easement in 1998 by the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program. The easement would have provided tax benefits in exchange for maintaining the building. The owner declined. The program could not force acceptance. The city had been approached by local preservationists in 2001, asking for a moratorium on demolitions along the old highway. The city council declined, citing property rights. The preservationists then formed a small nonprofit. They raised $12,000 in 2 years. That was enough to buy the sign but not the building. The owner refused to sell the sign separately. The sign was integral to the motel. After the demolition, the sign disappeared. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the gap between cultural value and legal protection. Route 66 was never a single piece of property. It was a collection of thousands of individual parcels, each owned by someone with financial interests. The road's significance as a whole did not translate into protection for each part. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 had created a framework for preserving historic buildings, but it applied primarily to federal projects. Private owners could do what they wanted. Route 66 motels and diners were private. Their owners often had no interest in preservation. They were running businesses. When the businesses failed, the properties were sold. The new owners rarely cared about history. They cared about the land. The Boots Motel demolition was covered by the Carthage Press. The article ran on page 3. It was 6 paragraphs long. The reporter interviewed the convenience store manager who said the new store would bring jobs. The reporter also interviewed a local historian who said the motel had hosted travelers since 1939. No photographs of the demolition were published. The article is now stored on microfilm. It has not been digitized. The memory of the motel exists only in the minds of those who stayed there or passed by. That memory is fading. The larger question is whether the systemic failures that allowed the Boots Motel to be destroyed have been addressed. They have not. The Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program operates on a limited budget. It provides grants for restoration, but the grants require matching funds. Many motel owners cannot afford the match. The program also lacks enforcement power. It cannot stop a demolition. It can only offer incentives. The incentives are often too small. The legal framework remains voluntary. By 2010, fewer than 40 of the original motels along the road had any form of historic designation. The human cost of these losses is measured in the stories that are no longer told. The Boots Motel had a register book with signatures from 1947 to 1990. The book was thrown into a dumpster during the demolition. A salvage worker later retrieved it. The book is now in a private collection, but its whereabouts are unknown. The signatures include truck drivers, families on road trips, honeymooners, salesmen, and servicemen returning from war. Those names are lost. The motel's neon sign had been photographed by a man named Sheldon Johnson in 1986. Johnson was a photographer who documented Route 66 neon for a decade. He died in 1998. His negatives were donated to a university archive. The archive holds 20,000 images. Only a fraction have been digitized. The Boots Motel sign appears in 3 of his photographs. The photographs are stored in a climate-controlled vault. No one has requested them since 2005. The neon signs that survive are maintained by individuals who carry the burden alone. The owner of the Munger Moss Motel in Lebanon, Missouri, still lights her sign every evening. She learned to replace neon tubes from a retired sign maker in 2008. The sign maker died in 2009. She now buys tubes from a company in Texas that is one of the last to make them. The company's owner is 73 years old. He has no apprentice. The knowledge is dying. The road itself continues. The interstate absorbs the traffic. The old highway is quiet. The motels that remain are mostly empty. Their signs do not light. The few that do light are maintained by people who refuse to let them go. They are the exception. The rule is loss. The rule is silence. The rule is a dimmer road every year. On the evening of October 19, 2012, the neon sign at the Wagon Wheel Motel in Cuba, Missouri was turned on for the first time in 6 years. The motel had been restored by a nonprofit group. The sign had been rebuilt using original photographs. The glass tubes were ordered from a craftsman in California. The sign was lit at 6:30 p.m. A crowd of about 40 people watched. The news station covered it. The photograph ran in the local paper. The sign has been lit every evening since. But the Wagon Wheel is one motel. It is not a system. It is not a policy. It is not a guarantee. The lost world of Route 66 motels, diners, and neon signs is not coming back. The road still exists. The signs that remain are fragile. The people who remember the road as it was are aging. When they are gone, the road will be a thoroughfare like any other. The neon will be replaced by LED. The motels will be replaced by chain hotels. Diners will be replaced by fast food. The character will be replaced by convenience. The world they lit is lost, and that loss is permanent. The question now is how many of the remaining pieces can be saved before the light goes out entirely. The answer depends on decisions made in the next decade. Those decisions are being made quietly in city council meetings, in real estate offices, in the homes of owners who can no longer afford to maintain a sign that no longer brings customers. The road waits. The signs wait, the light waits, but not forever.